morning everyone, I'm Ombarus and how about some refactoring this week? How do you do it? Where do you do it? When do you do it? And why does everyone hate it? And why am I making a video that everyone's gonna hate? That's either gonna be funny or tragic depending on the number of views this video gets. I'm saying all this because sometimes you have to give up on something you really like. And I really liked my equipment system that I did with mounts. So you had different mounts for different type of item, like the weapon mount, the shield mount, the crafting converter mount and stuff like that. I liked how I implemented it in code because I could do something like just player.getAttribute mount.converter, for example, and it would get me the information. I've been thinking this whole week, and for a long time, I want my player to be able to equip multiple weapons, maybe even multiple shield. Maybe I want him to have multiple utility mount points. And I think it's an important feature for the game because it allows me to make much more interesting ships. Like maybe some frigates have a lot of mount points, but other frigates have very few mount points, but more weapon. And you get to choose like which one you would like, right? If all the ships can only have a certain number of mount points of a certain type, then it's much more limiting, I feel. The only way I could think of the player having multiple equipment of the same type was to put them in an array. And if I do that in my JSON, then of course in the code, I have no choice but to implement a loop of some kind to loop over all the potential weapons he has equipped. And that opened a whole can of worms, but it also made the code kind of ugly, I think. I mean, now, instead of doing this simple two-liner to get my the information for my converter or something like that, now I have to do this. Instead of doing just get the utility, I had to do like, okay, get all the utilities, then load all the utilities, then if there's some utilities, then loop over each utilities, and it's kind of ugly, but I guess I don't have any choice. I tried to find a better solution, but they all came short, and, well, that's life. So refactoring is basically just revisiting a whole bunch of code you did and making big change to it and breaking everything. In my case, changing the JSON to be an array in the mount and changing the way I access the mount was just the beginning. It opened a whole can of worms. The first thing was that all my UIs that were accessing the mount had to be redone because it used to be enough to just know which mount I was accessing, but now I needed to add some mount index to tell me which element in the mounting list I had to access. So I did that for all the UIs that I already had, and then when I got to the drag and drop, it got even worse because I told you guys in my previous episode that I already had some issue with how to handle the logic of what all you can do when you're doing drag and drop. And I realized when I was revisiting this code that I made a kind of simplification that was a bit troublesome for this mount array thing. So as you can see before, I was only passing the index of the source because I wanted to know which item I was dragging, but I didn't need to pass the index of the destination. I just passed the container because it didn't matter. If I was dragging it on the cargo, it went with everything else. It didn't matter where you dropped it. But now, for the mounts, it matters where you dropped it. I want to know if it's weapon 1 or weapon 2 or weapon 3 or something like that. So I had to add this content index destination, which required a whole more bunch of changes and stuff like that. But in the end, you know, I fixed some stuff. It was kind of nice, and well, I got all the UI to work again. Took me a couple of days. Nah, maybe not. It took me at least a day to get it all working again. Then when I had fixed all the crashes in the UI, in the equipment and inventory windows, I had to think about, okay, but what's the actual effect of having multiple of the same type of object in the game? So what happened if the player equips multiple shields? What happened when he equips multiple weapon? What happened when he equips multiple utility, like tools? For this, I went again to my favorite game, NetHack, and I started thinking about what they're doing with this kind of stuff. And I know in NetHack, they kind of frown on multi-layering. So if you're trying to put multiple armor on top of each other or something like that, it's gonna come with a diminishing return. And the way they do that, as far as I remember, I didn't really check, but the idea I came up with based on that was that every time you put on the same thing multiple times, then you're gonna get half the strength of this item. So, for example, in the shields, now, when you have multiple shield equipped, instead of, once again, ugly code, instead of just getting my shield data and doing the shielding that get max HP, now I have a whole method, but this method calculates some layering. So it's not mean. First it orders the shields by which shield have the most armor, and then it's gonna start by adding the main armor like this, and then it's gonna grow through all the other armor, and then it's gonna reduce their power. So the way it works is it's exponential. So the second one will be at half power, the third one will be at a quarter power, and the fourth one will be at an eighth of the power, which means you'll never be able to double your shield capacity. At best, you're gonna get at like 1.9 or 1.99 or something. So the idea with that is that it still gives you a certain advantage to equipping multiple shields, right? Because 150 shield is always better than 100 shield. Still, it makes it so that someone with 4 shield is not going to be so totally overpowered facing someone with 1 shield that he has no chance to win, right? So I think it's a nice compromise. I'm not sure it's going to work. We'll see. Maybe I could tweak it. Maybe it's not going to be 50%. It could be like 70% or something like that. I mean, it's possible. But for now, that's what I came up with. And then there's the final challenge. What happened when you're trying to shoot multiple weapons at the same time that have potentially different attack pattern, different damage, different range? And for these kind of problems that might be a little bit more complicated, I like to try to see what other peoples have done and try to think about it from a player perspective. So what other people have done? Well, I know in NetHack, if you equip 2 weapons, then the second weapon will just be a secondary hit linked to your first weapon. But it's a little bit difficult for me to do this because my weapons are ranged. And in NetHack, of course, the range of the weapon is always melee when you have more than one weapon equipped. Then you could check how Cogmine do it. I think they do it really nice. You can equip multiple weapons, and then when you select a target, then any weapons that can hit that target will fire at that time. Without any actions, you can always turn on and off which weapon you want to fire. So, for example, if you're in close range and you don't want to fire your rocket launcher, you can just turn it off for that turn and then shoot your shotgun or whatever. That's also a very nice idea. And then I thought about, okay, from a player perspective, what is it that I want to do when I have more than one weapon? Well, the first thing is I'm trying to save some action, right? If I'm firing multiple weapons at the same time, then instead of taking maybe 10 turns to fire 3 weapons, it might take me like 3. So that's a very positive thing. And then there's the possibility that I might want to shoot multiple targets, right? If I know that this ship is going to die from my 1 missile, then maybe I want to use my 2 laser turrets for another target. And of course, this being a tactical, I want to be able to change my mind at any point in time. So either all the weapons shoot at the same time at the same target, or if I have to choose target, I want to be able to cancel and then start over again. So for me, it was quite obvious the only possible solution for that was to ask sequentially the player what he wants to shoot and which targets he wants to shoot with for every weapon he have equipped. This was a little bit of a challenge. As you can see in the code, the way it used to work is that in my weapon button, I was just getting the weapon data, and then I would request the targeting overlay with the callback process attack selection, and in the callback for the process attack selection, then I would just deal the damage with the weapon I had equipped. But now it's not so simple, because I have to chain potentially multiple things. And since I want to be able to cancel them, every time a player selects a target, I cannot shoot right away. I have to accumulate this information until all the weapons have been decided and then shoot them at the same time. And so the way it works now is that in the player system, I have this array of weapon shots. And probably it's not a good idea to keep it as a global inside a system. But since the player system is really just for the one player, I mean, ideally, probably I want to save this in the attributes of the player node so that if I ever have like some multiplayer or something, then it can handle more than one player. But for now, you know, it'll be a refactoring for next time. And this weapon shot will have some shooting states in it, waiting for targeting, waiting for damage, and done. And now in the pressed weapon callback, which is there, what I'm doing is I'm loading all the weapons again with this ugly loop instead of a simple line. And then I'm just pushing the weapons data and setting the state to initialized. And then I take the first weapon and I request the targeting overlay for that first weapon. So one of the nice things there is that I didn't have to change my targeting. I was afraid I was going to have to pass all the information about all the weapons to the targeting. But then I realized that the targeting, if I'm doing it sequentially, only needs to know about one weapon at a time. So I don't need to change anything. The player is keeping the list of weapons. And what happened is that when the process attack selection callback is called, at the bottom here, somewhere here. So when this method is called, then it's a little bit more complicated than before. Instead of just doing the damage, just doing the on-deal damage on the weapon data like before, now we have all this part before. What we're basically doing is we look for what we've already shot, what we were waiting, and there's always only one weapon that's in waiting for targeting, right? So when we find the waiting for targeting, we set its target in the array, in the dictionary from before, and we tell that we're waiting for damage. And then we go to the next shot. So the next one that requires targeting. And if we have a weapon that requires targeting, then we just abort and pop up another targeting overlay. And when all of this is done and the last callback is called, then we check all the targets. If there is a target, because it's possible that you just canceled all the shots. If there's no target, then we just abort everything. But if there is at least one weapon shooting at one specific target, then we do the on-deal damage for all the shots in the list. And this created another interesting issues where, well, actually it created two interesting issues. The first one was I wanted the action points to be in parallel, meaning if you shoot a weapon that takes 4 action points, one that takes 2 action points, and one that takes 3 action points, I don't want to sum all of these action points, but I want the slowest weapon to be the total action points you spend on your action. And I wasn't sure how to do that. I thought maybe I'm going to have to modify the damage so that it takes an array of weapons and then it manages to do all the stuff simultaneously. But I thought this was very painful, and kind of like the targeting system, I didn't want to have to modify it. The damage system doesn't need to know that you're firing multiple weapons. It just needs to know what you want to damage. So the kind of workaround I figured is I added these two new actions, these two new signals, on begin parallel action and on end parallel action. And what this does, when you call the onUse action point, instead of immediately using them, if the object specific, because in theory it shouldn't happen, of course, but like I was saying in the player, the action point works for all the AI and all the objects in the game, so I have to store this inside the object and not inside the system, because when you're doing parallel for one object and not all of the object. So I'm storing this inside the attributes of the node, but if the object in the attribute is set to parallel, then whenever you use some action point, it's just going to put them into an accumulator, which is just basically an array of how many action points you've been using. And when you end the parallel action, then it's going to look at which of the actions you did was the longest, and then it's going to just call the regular on use action point, but for this maximum action point, which makes it that everything happened in parallel. It'll clear the array and everything, and it works. It's beautiful, I think. I like it. And the second problem, and that was a crash while I was testing, is what happens if you shoot 3 missiles to the same target, but it dies after the first missile? What happened to your other 2 missiles? And this was a little bit tricky because, once again, it's not the player that's responsible for calculating the damage, so the player doesn't know that your target is dead. It just knows what target you want to hit. And you've chosen them before you applied the damage, so they were valid targets when you started applying damage. But until you calculate the damage, you don't know if the target is dead. And only the damage system knows that the target is dead. And when the target is dead, it's either going to play some animations and stuff, or it's just going to, get deleted. And I couldn't find a very good way to do that, but one thing I knew was that even if there's no animation, because if there's an animation, of course the object stays there a little longer, but I've said in a previous episode I don't want to rely on the animations to delete my objects. But even if there's no animation, Godot is not going to delete an object right away. There's a method called queue_free, and this method is not going to delete the node right away. It's going to wait until it's a safe time to delete this object. So I know as long as I'm in the same frame, or at least in the same process or the same thread, that it's okay for me to rely on this object until the end of its life. So what I did is that I write in the properties of the node that it's been deleted, so that the player, when it's looping on the target, it can check if its state is destroyed. And if its state is destroyed, then it'll just cancel the other shots. I don't see any better way of doing it, because there's no way for me to know the target has been destroyed before the player starts applying damage, and if he starts applying damage, then he has to finish applying all the damage. I don't want him to interrupt his shots in the middle, being like, oh, okay, you now can shoot some other target because this one is dead. I think it's fine like that. I might also make him shoot in the emptiness, because like if he has some ammos or something, I might want him to use the ammos, because he didn't know either. He took a risk. I'm going to shoot 3 missiles at this guy, even if I know he might die after the first one. So that might be part of the gameplay. For now, it's just going to cancel the 2 last shots because the first one killed the enemy. We'll see, maybe I can revisit that later. Some more refactoring. And that's how it works. I mean, you do something, when you're not sure how to do it, you do it one way, and you just make sure that if you ever have to come back to it, it's going to be in a state that it's fairly easy to change it to do whatever you want, right? And so after all this, I was basically back where I was before, because the gameplay was the same, except that now you can equip more than one weapon. But it took me nearly the whole week to redo all of this mount system, all the UI and all the stuff. But, I mean, it was necessary. I needed this feature, I wanted to have it, and I just did it. And I hope this helps you understand a little bit more how I do my refactoring. Maybe you have a different ways of doing it. If you have, please let me know in the comment section, and keep watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and see you guys in my next episode. Bye!